I'd like to welcome everyone this evening to this extraordinary conversation on the healing power of poetry with Dr. Norman Rosenthal, who is a world-renowned psychiatrist, medical doctor, and best-selling author, to be joined in a few minutes by Jan Weissmiller, who herself is a wonderful poet and scholar, and also owner of what I think is one of the most iconic independent bookstores in America, and that is Prairie Lights in Iowa City. But it's an interesting discussion because during these times of great stress and uncertainty and trauma and fear, we're told by our doctors, well, you should eat right and you should be sure to get enough sleep and you should exercise and you should meditate and you should maintain really good personal relations, friendships. But now we hear from Dr. Norman Rosenthal that we should read poetry. And this comes from a brilliant scientist himself. So we're going to find that out tonight, more about poetry, more about the healing power of poetry. And I want to begin by citing, because there are skeptics, the healing power of poetry. Jane Brody, some of you may know if you're a reader of the New York Times, is one of the most renowned and respected columnists, health columnists in the country. And she had her doubts about poetry, and she's friends with Dr. Rosenthal. And Dr. Rosenthal sent her a copy of his book, PoetryRx. And she wrote in a wonderful column, I now realize, thanks to Dr. poems I now realize, thanks to Dr. Rosenthal, can be a literary panacea for the pandemic. They let us know that we are not alone, that others before us have survived devastating loss and desolation, and that we can be uplifted by the imagery and cadence of the written and spoken word. Before we get to Dr. Rosenthal, I would like to just say that if you're interested in asking, if you have questions, you can write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. Also, I wanted to say that if you're interested in purchasing a copy of Dr. Rosenthal's book, PoetryRx, that I wanted to announce that Dr. Rosenthal has very generously offered to donate 100% of his profits from the sale of the book tonight to helping veterans overcome post-traumatic stress disorder. So, someone who feels very strongly about Dr. Rosenthal and the healing power of poetry is a friend of Norman's. Her name is Katie Finneran, and she's a two-time Tony Award-winning actress who's currently working with director Julian Fellows on a TV series about the Gilded Age. She made a short 1-minute video that I want to share before we go to you, Norm, so get ready.
Hi, I'm Katie Finneran. I'm so excited to be with you this evening, even though I am not live. Norman Rosenthal is a beautiful, beautiful close friend of mine. And a couple of years ago, he told me about his idea for this book and that he was beginning to work on it. And I was very encouraging. But I knew in my heart, little place in my heart, that poetry has never been something that I've turned to for comfort. Intellectually, I could understand it, but it never really spoke to me. I just couldn't feel it the way that I knew that I was supposed to. So when he sent me an advance copy, I began to read it, and then reading how he relates it to people that are struggling. At 50, all of a sudden, I'm saying poetry in a whole new way. It's like opening a door to a bunch of new friends. This is One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these things will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch. And look, my next to last, the 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. I shouldn't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like. Write it like disaster.
Dr. Norman Rosenthal is a world-renowned psychiatrist, researcher, and best-selling author who first described seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, and pioneered the use of light therapy as a treatment during his 20 years at the National Institutes of Mental Health. Currently clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine, Dr. Rosenthal has written or co-authored over 200 scholarly articles and 10 popular books, including the New York Times bestseller Transcendence, Healing and Transformation Through Transcendental Meditation, and the national bestseller Supermind. We are here to discuss, as I said, his most recent book, PoetryRx, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Heal and Bring Joy to Your Life. Dr. Rosenthal, so much to discuss this evening. Before we get into the healing power of poetry and bring on our friend Jan Weissmiller, could you please tell me why you selected this particular poem as the first poem in your book?
Well, thanks, Bob. First of all, it's a wonderful poem, and it embodies the principle of the book, and that is how poetry can help one heal. And that is how it was one night when a friend called, telling me he had lost someone very dear to him. And thinking of what I could say that might comfort him, I said, you know, losing is an art. And like all art, it can be developed. And immediately I heard a change in his voice as he said, do you know the poem? And then he pulled it off his shelf and started to read it to me. And you've just heard Katie beautifully reading this poem. And as he finished reading, I could feel his voice lifting. He was clearly cheered up, and so was I.
Healing power of poetry? How is it possible that words, I'm playing not the devil's advocate, but just a novice. How is it that words can heal? And why would you prescribe it?
Well, if you think of it, when we're very little, the first pain that we feel when we fall and scrape our knee or get injured in some small way, when we have a boo-boo, our mother or our parent says, now, that's going to be all right, and maybe sings something to us or says something to us. So words from the very earliest times are already being used as part of the healing of a wound, whether it's a physical wound or a psychological wound. Little child comes home from school, she or he has been bullied. Settle down, now it's okay. We use words to communicate ideas, but we also use them to soothe. And there's something about poetry, the way in which those words are organized, their rhythms, their cadences, as you said, that are a little bit like a song. And you know how a lullaby, one of the poems, in fact, in the collection is called Lullaby, how a parent sings a lullaby to soothe a child who's having trouble sleeping. So we're talking about an array of different wounds, whether it's pain, physical or psychological, or other forms that can be helped by words. And poems, in a way, are the most beautiful way words can be put together.
So how would you use a poem in a session with a patient?
Well, let me share an example from Rumi. Rumi is the 13th century Persian poet, and I often will get in my office, I will get people coming in as couples and arguing with each other. He did this, she did that, who's right, who's wrong. They're at loggerheads with each other. And they turn to me. I must judge, I must issue a verdict, I must make a sentence and who has to pay whom and how it's all going to be settled. And I tell them, you know, I'm not a judge. I'm a therapist. I'm here to bring the two of you together, not to judge who's right and who's wrong. So unconvinced, they keep squabbling. And I say, well, how would you like to how would you like to hear a very ancient poem? And they kind of startle because it's an unexpected intervention. But they know I'm eccentric, so they humor me. So I say, okay, this is by Rumi. It's called Out Beyond Ideas. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. And there you have it. Who's right, who's wrong? Let's not worry about that. There's a field. I'll meet you there. The poet makes the first move, modeling for these squabbling people that somebody's got to make the first move. Reach out your hand, give the person a kiss or a hug, and say, I'll make the first move. Because when we're lying down in that field, maybe we can remember what brought us together in the first place. Why we got engaged, why we got married, why we had children. Let's put this fight aside and rediscover that bond.
Thank you, Norman. Jan Weissmiller was the first full-time employee after Prairie Lights bookstore in Iowa City opened in 1978. She and a fellow poet, Jane Mead, bought the store in 2008, and she has been the sole owner since Jane's untimely death in 2019. Jan received her MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop in 1984 and was awarded the Los Hills Poetry Award for her collection, In Divided Light, which came out in 1999. Jane occasionally teaches at the Iowa Summer Writing Festival and has reviewed poetry for the Boston Review. Jane, what are your thoughts on the book? What are your thoughts on Norman's assertion that there's a healing power to poetry?
That has been true for me all my life, and I'm not in the position as he is to try to help other people with it who come to me with their problems very often, but it's sort of given me courage to think about doing that. I'm in Prairie Lights all the time where I'm selling poetry to people, and I'm talking to people about how they're afraid of poetry. You know, they're afraid that they won't understand it. They say they don't like it. And I try to help them with that by showing them rhythmic poems whose meaning is not necessarily purely the words, but is the feel of the, like Norm was saying, the cadence of the language to make them feel what I've always felt about poetry. And it's interesting listening to Norm talk about lullabies or the soothing words that a parent would use. I am very blessed to have been read to from my earliest memories, and poetry, A Child's Garden of Verse, the A.A. Milne poems. Those were read to me, and I bonded with my parents while they were reading them to me, and so I think I've always been very soothed by poetry, and it's wonderful to have this book that I can give to people that need it.
Yeah. Jan, is there a particular poem in PoetryRx that resonates with you? And if so, which one?
Well, I of course do love One Art, and I enjoyed reading the Stevie Smith poem, Not Waving But Drowning, because I had known that poem, but I never really quite understood it in the way that I did reading it in PoetryRx. But many of the poems, I also feel like I have always known and loved Do Not Go Gentle Into This Good Night, but I understood something about that poem reading it in PoetryRx that I had not. I guess something about rage that I had not quite understood before. I mean, I think the book is just full of wonderful poems. I tried to put some of the books back here that, you know, that there are 3 Emily Dickinson poems in the book. The Wordsworth in the book, the Daffodils and Tintin are fabulous. And in conversation with Elizabeth Bishop, if you read her wonderful poem, Crusoe in England.
I have to applaud you over the years, because I have family who live in Iowa. I've come and visited. I'm a big aficionado of independent bookstores, and I have always loved Prairie Lights and what you do, what you've done there, and the influence that you create, that is felt as soon as you walk in. So I wanted to thank you for hosting, helping to host this event. And I want to go back to Norman for a question. Norm, you've written many books on winter blues, on seasonal affective disorder, on meditation, so many different books. What was it like to write this book on poetry? Was it hard to sort of get your head around it? What was the experience like?
Well, I've lived with these poems for a long time, and I've struggled to find a way of putting them together so that they will be appealing. But I did find a structure during the pandemic, with all our isolations and our deprivations and our fears. At home, secluded, I opened up this treasure trove of poems and played with them, and found a way of setting out the poem, then a short discussion, then some takeaways, and then the short biography of the poet, and how that kind of dovetailed with the contents of the poem. Because our creations are they spring organically from our own being and our own lives. It may be if we write fiction, not so much, maybe it does. Most people in some ways write their own stories, but with the poems, it was very clear that they connect with the poets. And so once I found that structure, I could replicate it many times over. And as one of my friends said, PoetryRx is very congenial to snacking. So feel free to snack. You don't have to.
Yeah, would you talk about the structure again? Just make clear how it's not just a collection of many 50 poems, your introduction and comments and takeaways.
Yeah, after an introduction, which sort of helps people know how to read a poem, then there are 50 poems, and they're organized in 5 sections corresponding to different domains of life: loving and losing, responses to nature, the search for meaning and the design for living, and that last stage of life, into the night. And then a ragbag of aspects of the human condition that didn't fit neatly anywhere else. And so I've tried to make it sort of like a long story, which hopefully we all have long lives and are able to enjoy and experience these different aspects. And I've organized the poems accordingly. But in each poem of the 50, I replicate the same structure so that it becomes familiar to the reader and very welcome. The poem, my thoughts, takeaways, and bio sketch. And it seems to have been well received.
Jan, I'm going to give you a chance to ask a question of Dr. Rosenthal, but I just want to make an announcement, a reminder here. We are, Jan is connecting from Prairie Lights Bookstore in Iowa City, and she graciously is hosting this remote book signing with Dr. Rosenthal. And I wanted to announce that 100% of the profits that would come to Dr. Rosenthal from the sale of his books this evening will all go towards a program called the Resilient Warrior Program, which will help veterans and their families with post-traumatic stress. So from my side, there's 2 wonderful reasons to, in addition to the great book, is to support Prairie Lights and Jan and her wonderful labors of love over all these years, and to support our veterans. So Jan, any question that you would like to address to Dr. Rosenthal? And I also want to say, if you have questions, the viewers, those of you who are connected, please write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will have them answer as many as we can. All right, thank you. Jan.
Was it hard to select the poems?
Well, it was hard to deselect the ones that came in over number 50. It was hard to exclude. It wasn't hard to include because every poem that I've included has meant something a lot to somebody I know, either a patient or a friend or myself. So these are all, it's like you're having a wedding or a celebration and you can only invite 50 guests. And it's not hard to figure out who you want to invite, but it's hard to exclude anybody. And I called him a friend who's a long-standing best-selling author, and I said, I've got 52. Is there something magical about the number 50? Can I squeeze in an extra 2? She said, no, there's something magical about 50. Cut 2 of them out. And when she talks, I listen. So.
What were the 2?
You know, I don't even remember because, you know, they're like old loves. You try not to linger with the memories.
Here's a question, Jan and Norman, that's just come in from Marianne. What poem was your first love? Personally, not what someone read to you, but your own discovery.
Well, that's a wonderful question. And I remember it clearly. I remember it being read in class. And in fact, the poem was called Poplars. And I'll read it here. It's by Helen Luty. 7 lovely poplars swaying in the breeze, 7 softly sighing, tall and slender trees, silvered by the moonlight, pointing to the sky. Look, like leafy spears, they hold the stars on high. And there was something about the alliteration, you know, 7 softly sighing. There was something about the imagery, silvered by the moonlight. They become like spears. They're holding the stars on high. Somehow, a simple image becomes magical in this very, very simple poem. And it gave me that first sparkle that poetry can do wonderful things. So I remember that poem.
I'd actually like both of you to comment on this, the essences of classical and modern poetry. Perhaps, Jan, you could do a little definition of of classical and modern poetry, and then your comments on clarity and obscurity.
So when you say modern, you mean contemporary, the sort of
Yes.
quite obscure contemporary poetry?
Yes.
It is. I guess I feel that it moved in the same way that painting moved. It's a very sort of similar trajectory that formal and classical poetry. Well, actually, poetry came from an oral tradition, which would explain some of the necessity of the formality. But when we moved on and the world started seeming more complex, especially in the 20th century, poetry also became more complex. And I feel like we shouldn't judge complex poetry. We should read it and see what it means to us. It will mean something if you're not afraid to let it mean something. And it does reflect the time we live in. But I think particularly right now in the pandemic and when things feel, you know, with the environmental crisis and the policing crisis and the news every night, it is nice to be able to return to classical poetry, to the comfort of the structures of classical poetry.
Norman, your thoughts?
Yes, I of course agree a lot with what Jan has said, but I think in formal classical poetry, there are rules of verse, rules of rhyming and rhythmic rules, and you can judge a good poem because it obeys those rules, which are very, very difficult to obey and still create a thing of beauty. So, and there are very relatively few examples that have succeeded at all these different levels, brilliant examples. and how they've managed to encompass as much as they have with that discipline is incredible. Then comes along modern poetry, where it doesn't have to rhyme, there doesn't have to be any fixed rhythm, it's just whatever you think is going to have the effect. And here, I think I am completely in agreement with Jan. So we're left sort of asking ourselves, how do we feel when we read these poems? We start, early 20th century with poets like T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland and other poems. And those poems have got a magic about them, even though they don't have formal rhythms, formal rhymes, all the way up to the present, much like I stand in front of a Mark Rothko, for example, which has got a red upon red rectangle. And what I've sort of realized is that if you can return to it again and again and have a certain feeling response and feel almost transformed, even if it doesn't have any rules, then that is a sign that there's something very magical going on here.
There's a question that came in. Is there a poem that's a universal elixir, something that's the perfect remedy for everyone? Or am I expecting too much from poetry?
My first instinct is to say, it kind of starts working on everybody and then we build up like antibiotic resistance. Because, after you've heard something too many times, it kind of loses its impact in a way. We develop variants, if you like. But seriously, no. I think that there are some poems that are going to help a lot of people, and some poems that will help only one or two people maybe, or a few people who it actually speaks to. But to the extent that we do have a universal elixir, or as close to it as will come, I would love to read Emily Dickinson's Hope.
Yes.
Because it's so powerful. And speaking of hope, I hope it's here in my collection.
Yes.
I will. No, we didn't put it
In the
here.
meanwhile,
I'll find it. Keep going.
okay. Jan, when did what was your first sort of, I don't know, transcendent experience or impactful experience with a poem? And what was it? And how old were you? Give us the context.
I think I was 10 or 11, and it was Annabel Lee, which I'm sorry I don't have memorized and I don't have at hand, but it's the Edgar Allan Poe poem, Annabel Lee, about the young woman that he lost. And it's incredibly rhythmic and incredibly beautiful and very sensual. And it was, I read it. I was just coming to the age where I could imagine what romantic love was.
And
yeah, I must say, I love The Kingdom by the Sea. So
yes,
there's Edgar Allan Poe's, his rhythms and his rhymes are so exceptional. Quoth the raven nevermore. He was so magical with words. If I may, here I have found in my book, Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
your commentary on that?
Yes, I recently, someone from the Middle East, I have some friends in the Middle East, and they wrote to me, one of them wrote to me and said, what PoetryRx can you suggest for me with all these terrible things that are happening here? And I offered her this poem and she came right back to me and she said, I was being sarcastic. there's no poetry that can help me here. And I was sort of quite chastened. And then I spoke with her some days later, and she said, you know that poem, Hope, that you sent to me? It really worked. I said it to myself and I actually felt better. And I thought this was an amazing vindication of what I believe Jan and I subscribe to, that this poetry can be powerful stuff.
There's a question for both of you. Is reading a poem aloud more potent than reading it silently? We'll start with Jan.
Possibly. I've always wondered if Emily.
Can you try and talk a little louder, Jan?
Can you hear me? I would say possibly. I think there are some poems, and I think Emily Dickinson, some poets, and I think Emily Dickinson is one of them, that the rhythms are so subtle. I mean, they're not subtle because they're hymn rhythms, but they are, in terms of their thoughts, they're so subtle and so fast that I do prefer to read them silently. Although Norm just read Hope is a Thing with Feathers beautifully. And I've always wondered if she read them out loud to herself or not. I've always kind of thought not.
Norman?
Well, I'm just taking off on what Jan is saying. It's almost like how Beethoven could continue to compose symphonies even when after he was deaf, that she may have not read them aloud, but she heard them in her head, I would say. And I think when you read a poem aloud, you bring into play different muscles, different neural pathways. And I think you do experience it in a different way. So I encourage people to do that. Memorize a poem so you can retrieve it at will. And it's a lovely cognitive exercise.
And as a psychiatrist, I know that writing and journaling, you know, for therapists, that's an important process. Do you find that writing poetry, do you ever advocate that? Or what are your thoughts on people journaling or writing or attempting to write poetry?
Well, I think if they want to write poetry, I think it's wonderful. I guess I'm shaped by my own experience of trying to write poetry and not doing a very good job at it. So I think writing is good, journaling is good, and there's a lot of data actually to support it. But when it comes to PoetryRx, I've really looked at the receptive aspect of great poetry.
I want to remind everyone that Dr. Rosenthal's book, PoetryRx, is available for purchase through Prairie Lights, and you can buy it at the bottom of in the chat box at the bottom of right there, and you can get a signed copy. And it's wonderful because it's an extraordinary book. It benefits Jan and her Prairie Lights bookstore, which you couldn't do a better mitzvah. And also the proceeds from Norman, the sales that would go to Norman is going to help veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. Norman, you're donating proceeds of your book very generously to help veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. What is your affinity there? Why did you select this particular population? And I know you actually have a poem in your book that speaks to PTSD. Could you read that and then comment?
Sure. It's a wonderful poem by the Russian poet Ana Akhmatova, who was extremely brave. She stayed in Russia through the terrible Stalinist years, despite suffering tremendously. Her husband had been killed in the Gulag. Her son was imprisoned in one of these work camps. And she just persevered and kept writing and kept basically opposing the fascist government. So here she is, The Sentence by Ana Akhmatova. And the stone word fell on my still living breast. Never mind, I was ready. I will manage somehow. Today I have so much to do. I must kill memory once and for all. I must turn my soul to stone. I must learn to live again. Unless summer's ardent rustling is like a festival outside my window. for a long time, I've foreseen this. Brilliant day, deserted house. So to me, because it could be obscure to somebody hearing it for the first time, to me, this is the kind of way in which traumatized people shut down. They can't stand the memories, they try and turn them into stone. But we're flesh and blood, we're not stone. You can't turn memories into stone. They stick around, they haunt you, they trouble you. So when there's a festival outside, you're unable to join it. You are like a deserted house. The bones are there, the structure is there, but the soul of the house has been turned to stone. And that's what she's brilliantly communicating here. Well, I first started working with PTSD sufferers from Iraq and Afghanistan when I had a clinical trials organization. And I was able to get a small grant, and I decided I was going to try transcendental meditation for those people, just in a pilot study, because I had benefited so much from the technique. And I saw these people being transformed under my eyes. One young man who had had an accident in Iraq because he went over a landmine was now haunted and unable to drive over a pothole without going into a flashback trauma. One night, he was in bed with his girlfriend and she bumped into him and he had her in a chokehold because it reminded him of the enemy attacking him in the middle of the night. And he settled down, he stopped drinking, he started studying, the relationship improved. And I thought, wow, this is really something. So I started working along with the David Lynch Foundation. We collaborated on a quite a large study in the San Diego VA hospital, comparing TM with a gold standard treatment and finding it to be no worse and much better than a control. And now, thanks to your ability to orchestrate and organize a big multi-center study is afoot. We're now we've got top investigators at multiple sites. And I am sort of thrilled to be a consultant on that project that you have sort of spearheaded. And so I have a deep-seated love for this topic. I had a dear friend named Jerry Yellen. He's written a book called The Resilient Warrior, and he bombed many times over Japan during the Second World War and came back with very much the symptoms that Ana Akhmatova describes. So this really is in memory of him that I include this poem.
Wonderful. I'd like to switch gears. I have one more question for you, Norm, and then I'm going to go back to you, Jan. The topic of transcendence, you wrote a book on transcendence. You speak about transcendence. The dictionary defines to transcend means to go beyond ordinary human limitations. One can transcend listening to music. One can transcend reading poetry. One can transcend writing poetry. One can transcend holding a newborn child in one's arms. It's a universal experience. So could you comment on, and what poem stands out? Because poets, many of them articulate that experience very eloquently.
Well, the Vedic tradition recognizes what they call a certain, the yogi Patanjali put it very well, where he said there's he said through a continuum of through a repeated process of settling, a continuum of calmness develops. So he said that, but the Upanishads say there's a mind within the mind, a mind beyond the mind, and recognizes that there are levels of consciousness that you can access that are beyond ordinary waking and sleeping and dreaming. So when you talk about transcending, that is really what we mean. We mean going into a place inside yourself that feels very different from ordinary waking. So in this collection, I include two poems that really capture transcending, and they're both by Wordsworth, who really just got the hang of transcending. A lot of the time he transcended in nature. And the one very famous transcendence is in the Daffodils. You know, at the surface, it's a very simple poem about a group of people who go into the country and they see a mass of daffodils and they come home. And now when he lies on his couch, he thinks about the daffodils. What's the big deal? Why at the 150th anniversary did 150,000 British school children recite the Daffodils? 150 years later, this little walk in the country is still memorialized. Why is that? Well, it's not the walk. It's what happened in Wordsworth's mind when he saw those daffodils. He transcended, and we hear the description of the daffodils. And we know transcendence to be a very mixed state. Some of it is very floaty and very, you know, what you'd think of. But some of it's very vibrant, and it can happen in the same session. So very famously, the poem says, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high or veils and hills. So you're feeling the floaty transcendence. And then he says, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. And he goes on in a sort of very sparkling way. And it goes to and fro through the poem until the very end, when he says, and oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye that is the bliss of solitude. So he has taken in the daffodils. They are now part of him. And they induce in him a state of wonder and of going beyond into the mind within the mind. And now, thanks to his brilliant poem, we can all do the same every time we read it.
Really beautiful. I want to switch gears just for a moment and ask Jan, who is the owner of the Prairie Lights bookstore in Iowa City. And she was the first full-time employee of the bookstore when it opened in 1978. Tell us about your bookstore and how it's lasted so long and why so many people love walking in your bookstore. And this, by the way, is not just a product placement. I genuinely have always wanted to ask you this question, Jan. What is it about your store?
Well, it's a wonderful place to have a bookstore with the Writers' Workshop here. And I think the size of the town is good too, because it's not too big. And so people from a lot of different disciplines know each other socially and are influenced by each other. And so there's sort of a merging of minds in the town in general. And the bookstore seems to be a place where those kinds of minds that want to merge come. And so it always feels pretty vital in here. I think it always has. And I think it's largely the place. It's Iowa City, I think. And now there's such a long history here. We've had so many wonderful readings here. We haven't been able to have readings for the last year and probably won't again until next year, live in-person readings, but there's sort of the ghosts of the poets, especially the poets, I think, that have read in this space. I believe that they're with us, that they give a depth and a presence to the store, even for people that have never attended one. I know that's kind of woo-woo, but I do feel that.
No, it's beautiful. But I beg to differ. It's not just a place. I think it's your heart and your mind. I really appreciate it. So I want to again remind everyone that Norman's book, PoetryRx, How 50 Inspiring Poems Can Bring Joy to Your Life, is available signed. If you want to purchase it, you can purchase it by going in the chat box, and there's a place that you can click and purchase it. And again, 100% of Norman's proceeds, the sale of that would go to him as the author, will go to helping veterans with post-traumatic stress. We have time for just a couple of more questions. Do you remember, this is for both of you, short answers, do you remember introducing somebody to poetry who didn't think they liked poetry? And big surprise, they ended up connecting with a poem and subsequently loved poetry thereafter. let's go with you, Jen. I mean, it must be someone walks into the store, you know, and you say, I have a book of poetry. And they go, nah. And then you change them.
Oh yeah, it actually happens more frequently than you think. People walk in the store and the poetry section is downstairs. We don't get good reception down there, so we couldn't have the poetry as the background. I mean, there's something that I put here, but poetry section is large and central, and so people that don't like poetry feel sometimes that they need to say that because they're in the poetry section, and so then I say, well, maybe I could show you a poem that you would like, and there are just many options for showing people a poem that they might like. They might like a simple William Carlos Williams poem, like the poem to Elsie. This is just to say, I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox that you were probably saving for breakfast.
Little louder, Jan, little louder.
The Williams poem for his wife Elsie. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox that you were probably saving for breakfast. Thank you. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold.
Nice. Norman, did you, well, I know you've heard it with your book. Maybe tell the story of Jane Brody, because that was quite
with Jane was wonderful, of course, because she was not inclined to write an article, and she said, you're telling me about your book, but I can't guarantee you a priori that I'm going to write an article about it. I said, of course you can't, but, you know, give it a chance. And to her huge credit, she was open-minded enough to completely change her mind about it with the help of a 94-year-old friend who told her that she'd loved it all her life, and that so Jane actually bought a copy of the book for her friend. But many people, and really I've written this book not just for poetry aficionados, but for ordinary people who think that they're not going to like poetry, but give it a little chance. And I'm finding with my patients, I'm saying, have you bought, or my clients, have you bought PoetryRx? Yep, I bought a copy, so they've done their duty. I said, have you read any of it? No. I said, well, why don't you try thus and such a poem? And you know, just like Jan is doing, because you know, the poem that she mentioned by William Carlos Williams is very simple, it's cheeky, it's sly. He's eaten the plums in the fridge that were left there for his wife, and she's going to open the fridge and she's going to be very disappointed. And so he's given her a little poem. Frankly, I would have preferred the plums, but there you are. So I think that people are more open and more accessible than one might think when it comes to poetry. But I really want to say to Jan, firstly, of course, thank you for hosting this event. But more than that, thank you for keeping alive a place that has always been magical. Not necessarily your specific bookstore, because I've never actually been in Iowa City, but bookstores like that have had to struggle so hard in this day of huge corporations, and have somehow succeeded just out of magic. And so to anybody who has a choice of getting the book here, I would ask you if you could do that, because you really are helping this amazing institution, Jan's in particular, but the institution in general, to survive, the one that's given us all so much pleasure.
Thank you. Any final comments, Jan?
Oh, that was lovely, Norm. That was very lovely. And I do believe that it is magic. I mean, that independent bookstores do survive by magic somehow. But I also think we're in a good moment. I think that the pandemic has made people value community and value the places that they've had in their communities, as it is hopefully making them value poetry, or, as you said, honor the receptive parts of themselves. Maybe we have, through this, developed the receptive parts of ourselves that respond to poetry.
So I want to thank you both very, very much. You, Jan, for hosting and then also coming out and participating in this lovely conversation. And you, Dr. Norman Rosenthal, extraordinary human being. I've said this before about you. There's a wonderful quote about a person who's enlightened in the best possible way. And they say, cool mind and a warm heart. And you have both. And you've really offered, all of your books have been gifts, but this is an extraordinary gift. And as you said, Jan, when we talked beforehand, it's a book that, you know, people will just give and give. It's a delightful give. And you, Norm, said, quoting your friend, it's a snacker. You just pick it up anywhere and be inspired, and it's not intimidating. And so many people say about, oh, I don't understand it. It doesn't make me, I feel I should understand it, and I don't understand poetry. It just makes me feel either not intelligent or not sophisticated. And of course, none of that need be the case. And you've really alleviated that weight on people, and you've brought a great deal of joy and happiness to their lives. So I thank you. And I also want to thank Dean Drasnan for organizing this. Dean is great. So thank you. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. And this will be posted, I believe, Dr. Rosenthal, on your website when it's edited together, normanrosenthal.com, normanrosenthal.com. Anyway, have a lovely evening. There was a big thunderstorm that just blew through Iowa, at least where I am, and that's long gone. So and if you're in Iowa City, go say hi to Jan. All right. Thank you at Prairie Lights. Thank you all very much. Really a delightful evening. Just special. Bye-bye.